something that we use a lot to authenticate across the several services that we have and transfer information across them. So the first change that we made was that now we use credentials as a generic thing. So we have this new hierarchical credentials approach that basically define this main credential, this main credential class here that sets a minimum set of methods and attributes that we need for that credential. And in that way, we can basically do work across the factory and the front end, which are two of GlideinWMS components, dealing with credentials without thinking too much about what they actually are. And an additional feature that we have now is that we can infer what credentials are from a text or simply a credential file. We can try and infer where within this tree here the credential falls. So we can either decide if it's a certificate, a token, or more specifically a side token or an ID token, and go from there, or whenever the credential type is relevant. Also, we are now implementing credential purposes, which basically help us decide what to do with a credential. Before, credentials could be used for many things. Now we have a way to define what a credential is actually used for, either to authenticate with a C or to be simply sent along with the job within the payload to be used by the job to authenticate with a data source or something like that. That also adds the ability to send lists of arbitrary credentials that our front-end operators might find useful to land at the final running location. And we also separate parameters, which before were classifiers of auth method in the GlideinWMS configuration. And they are now their own entity. And they are orthogonal and independent from credentials. So you can define extra parameters such as VM type and VM ID if you're running on a cloud resource, for example, such as AWS or Google Cloud. And you can now define them independently for every credential that you have. And before, they would actually be bound to the auth method. So that was a bit not very flexible. And you can do that by using the new auth method syntax. Now, instead of simply defining one authentication method here, you can pick many of them. And these commas and semicolons here have a or and end syntax. So the idea of this example here is that for this specific entry, this auth method requires either a side token or a proxy alongside a VM ID and a VM type. We also revamped our credentials generator model. So GlideinWMS already supports credential generators. What we did is that now we created a whole generators framework that can be used for both credentials and parameters. We're also introducing some pre-built generators that can be used straight from the configuration without the need of actually touching code. These two examples here show how we can define a round-robin generator, which is a built-in generator that comes with GlideinWMS, to create a credential generator that will round-robin through cred1, cred2, cred3, which are just text type credentials. In a similar way, you can define a parameter that uses the same generator, but now you're generating VM1, 2, and 3, which are just strings for this specific parameter here. So while implementing all these features, we've came across three main challenges that we still have to address, and that might be interesting to bring up to the Conda community so we can either be instructed or work together on the solutions for that. So the first one that we have is because now we can infer the credential type of a string or a file. We had a pretty good success in figuring out if a credential is a token, basically a JWT, but it's not so simple for us to define if something is a side token versus an ID token. Well, side tokens actually have a few claims that can help us identify it. So we require something like a ver, which has a profile and a version, usually side token and a number. So that's a pretty good hint. You can use something like JDI along with the issuer to try and figure it out. And side tokens and ID tokens also use different authentication encryption methods. So that really helps us. But what we really can't for sure is tell if something's an ID token or not. I mean, we know for sure it's a JWT, and maybe it's not a side token, but is it an ID token? So this is something that we're still working on. Maybe something like what WLCG tokens do, which is they claim this WLCG.ver parameter here. That could maybe help. So that's an idea. Next challenge that we still have is, because now we can provide several credentials along with a Gliden, it would be interesting if CEs would be able to fall back across different credentials as well. So these claims that I make here are generic. They're not true for every authentication method in CEs, but in general, once a CE during the negotiation phase agrees on a credential type, it will basically try and use the first credential file that it finds for that type. If it fails, it will fail the authentication. It will not, or the authorization, I should say. And it will not fall back to other credential types in general as well. So we can try to do something like to address this problem on the GlideinWMS side. Actually, we already do. We generate some several versions of JDFs and try them. But if the CE could do something on their side, maybe our code could be a bit simpler as well. Finally, and that's an issue that's been a discussion with especially Todd and Jamie for the past year at least. Tokens are in general shorter lived than proxies are. And what happens is, if we send them in our job payloads, they will eventually expire, and there is no easy way for us to renew them. So we have to come up with a way to renew these tokens, either from GlideinWMS side, but if something could be done from the counter side, that would be simpler and maybe would also address other use cases for this issue. And yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all I had. That were the challenges that I had. Any questions or comments?
All right, I think I see Jason.
Hey Bruno, thanks for your work on this. Maybe I missed something. Can you explain the importance of needing to identify the token types versus, could the front end specify what each token type is?
Right, and that's right. So when you point us to a credential, you usually tell us what the credential type is. Something that sometimes is useful for us is we sometimes transfer credentials as encrypted text, basically encrypted strings on class heads. And if we can infer what the credential type is, we don't need to pass basically two parameters, just one would be enough. Otherwise, we have to either send the credential itself alongside its type on a separate parameter, or a combination of both within the same class head parameter. It's not necessary, and we can work around it in some other ways, but if we could, it would be nice. It would be cleaner, I'd say.
Thank you.
Oh, and by the way, something that I forgot to mention. So all these features are already available in the latest release candidate for GlideinWMS 3.11.
Let's thank our speaker again.